Good morning. To get to peace, sometimes first we need to protest. Psalms of praise are different from psalms of protest. Psalms of praise, keep your eyes open. You see what God is doing in the world, the wonders that have been made, and that brings praise. It's a witness. Psalms of protest are the opposite, because you don't see where God is, you don't know what God is doing, and you're wondering, where are you, God? That's protest. It's that space between seeing the world as it currently is and knowing it could be so much better. It could be so much more. And we want to get there, don't we? Yes. Protest is wailing, God, let your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Peace takes time. That's the story of our country. Because we need time not just to identify and name the ruptures that have been broken, but to see what Friedrich Buechner says, that we're not just broken, but we're broken open. We need to be transformed, as Terry was saying. It's like W.B. Yeats's poem, The Isle of Innisfree, and I shall have some peace there, but peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the crickets sing. I want to tell you the story of how we've been using the Psalms of Lament in our culture to encourage the peace that drops slowly. I grew up in Northern Ireland in a town called Lurgan during the period of conflict, the 30-year period known as the Troubles. And I grew up in part of a trio of towns that formed a triangle, and it was one of the murder triangles, a very concentrated place where there were a lot of murders, a lot of killings. There was a heavy military presence in our town as a child. The army had been brought in from England, and we frequently were stopped and checked, asked by men with English accents, where are you going? What is the business that you're going to do? What's the purpose of your journey? And because of that, people became desperate enough to resort to violence. There were nearly 3,500 people killed during the conflict, which might not seem like a lot in this country, but for a country as small as ours, that was 1% of the population. So if the Troubles had happened here, that would be 6 million people. If you're a part of a congregation of 100, there'd be at least one person who was killed, and many more affected. And even though the town was under curfew at night, the barricades went up to prevent the bombs being carried in. Lurgan was bombed twice during my childhood. This is the 1992 bomb. A 1,000-pound explosive brought in a car, and it was so big you could hear the bomb within a 25-mile radius. We lived a mile from the town, and if I close my eyes, I can still feel the shudder of the bomb going through you. But what psalms do you sing in worship when you're living in conflict? We sang the same songs as you did here. Terry talked about the new Indian version. Well, we called it the Northern Irish version. We'll talk about it later, Terry. But we sang, all people that on earth do dwell, Psalm 84, how lovely is your dwelling place. The Lord is my shepherd. Occasionally, we sang 1, 2, 4. If the Lord had not been on our side, would we still be here today? But we didn't talk much about the troubles on a Sunday. There was silence, say nothing. Because Sunday worship is a shelter place. It's where you want to feel safe, away from the trauma. Because the horror on the streets was a deep wound. We needed a place to shelter. But at times, I would say our worship was guilty of mimicking an unrealistic optimism, that everything's just fine, we'll carry on, we'll keep praying till we get to our eternal home. But it was disconnected. It was more like a street party than the morning bench. But when you're traumatized, trauma has a way of spilling out. Silence can burn you, and eventually it'll erupt out of your wounds. Let me fast forward to 2019. Oh, it's gone. Can we have a clicker on instead of my? Yeah, 2019. 20 years after the peace agreement. And we begin to ask the Lin-Manuel Miranda question: who lives, who fights, who tells your? And so this book was published on behalf of the Presbyterians in Ireland. It just gathered the stories of Presbyterians during the Troubles, over 120 people from all over Northern Ireland, telling the story of how a family member was murdered, how they dealt with the pain. Clergy talked about how they approached the funerals, how they had to speak out during the funerals, don't retaliate, how they had to quash and deal with the pain. And stories that told about the struggle to hold on to faith and how isolating grief is, how hard it is. And whilst this book was a gracious remembering, giving voice to the wounds that had travelled to the heart, it also brought up new questions. Such as, well, my pastor was wonderful when I lost a family member, but where was the church as a denomination? They didn't speak out much. They were silent. Were they too afraid to confront the political leaders of the time? And at times, denominational unity seemed more important than loving your enemy. And so the Presbyterian Church in Ireland was open to receive these kind of critiques. And 2 years ago, they approached me and said, what will we do with this? How do we keep moving on in our journey? How do we follow on a project that helps name our complicity in the Troubles? So what we decided to do was to reconvene all those focus groups all over Northern Ireland, whoever still wanted to come. But in each group, we would invite a Roman Catholic friend to sit with us and listen, so that we weren't navel-gazing, but that the other was present to help break us open to other people's pain too. And each of those 8 focus groups all over Northern Ireland focused on one lament psalm each. It was important that we weren't just taking people back into the wounds to re-traumatize, because that would sabotage the healing. But the goal was, like the Holy Spirit, to hover over the troubled waters of creation, hovering over the pain to see where God could lift us to a new, spacious place. And so the groups were in different locations, and we tried to match the lament psalm with that particular context. in County Armagh, which is close to the border. It's largely rural, it's border territory. The army would have come into the fields and hid there, which meant many of the fields were set as booby traps and ambush. And so in County Armagh, we looked at the ambush psalm, Psalm 64. God, hear my troubling thoughts. Hide me from conspiracy, because the perfect ambushed words are snares to me. Hide me, Lord. And then further west, we went out, and the enemy wasn't living in segregated areas. The enemy was actually your neighbor, your farmer, who informed on you so that the enemy could attack your eldest son and take the land. And so when we went there, we talked about the Psalms of betrayal, the Judas Psalm, Psalm 109. Then we went to towns that had the bombs, major bombs. And even though those bombs happened decades ago, when the people began to talk about them, it was like it was just yesterday. It was still raw. And we sat in a church where there'd been displacement. This church had to move, get out of the town and go and relocate. They told stories of how when the church was burning in the 1980s, this man tried to lift the organ and carry it physically out of the building to save it. And the pain of injustice. We're not worshipping in the place we want to be. Why, God? And we looked at Psalm 7 and Psalm 82. Rise up, O God, and act in justice. And then there were softer places where you go to the East Coast, which was more sheltered, less bombings. There we talked about silence. That's what was experienced there. Institutional silence. Let's not talk about it. God's silence. And we use Psalm 39, the walls of silence that cause so much pain and uncertainty. And once we did this lament Psalm Bible study, we went away, we fused the stories of context along with the words of the psalm, and we put them to music. Then we came back and presented it to each group and allowed them to be in control of the edit. So what did we learn in the process? The Psalms of Lament helped us reinterpret how we saw our enemies. When you grow up in a culture like ours that's so binary, so deeply polarized, what becomes important is that you don't lose, because there's one winner and there's one loser. You want to be on the winning side, but the gospel doesn't look at it that way. The gospel takes us on a pilgrimage to see our enemies as our friends, to decouple national identity with our religion, and instead be followers of the Lamb who was slain. And so the first time I returned back to the Dungannon town group, we'd been looking at the imprecatory psalm, Psalm 109, that launches out with this deep invective against the enemy. May his days be cut short. May another take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless. May his wife be a widow. That's hard. But as we held that, we came to realize this isn't vengeance taking. In fact, it was the opposite. It was saying, rather than exacting violence on the one who has offended me, well, here's what I would like to do, Lord, but I'm going to leave it up to you. You're sovereign. As an act of imperfect faith in a perfect God, here's how I feel. It's over to you now. But we went further. When I presented the song, the group stopped me and said, Karen, see that first line? Rewrite it. I started with the words, "My God, whom I praise, you have been silent." And they said, "Well, Karen, we just can't get to praise yet. We need to start with the lament. You're trying to fix us too quickly." And so the first line changed and became, "Why should I praise? Why? Have you been silent, Lord?" And my learning was it made me more honest. Paul Tillich talks in his work, The Ground of Being, about how suffering takes you to a deep cavity, and then a deeper cavity, and then a deeper cavity, until you're at the basement of your assumed identity. And you come to realize, I'm not the person I thought I was. And you're confronting a truer, more vulnerable identity. That suffering's not utilitarian, it's not this megaphone to the world, but it's a way of reconnecting us to our Maker and to our real selves. It gently exposes we're all hypocrites, we all mask pain. And in the group, when we were wrestling with the language of cursing our enemies, one person said, "But the enemy's not out there, the enemy's in here. It's in me. I'm not just a victim, but I'm a perpetrator too. I still think in ways that cause harm to others. And I need this psalm to work through me, to confess my own complicity." In one of our groups, a Roman Catholic friend who'd been in peacemaking for years said, "I've never been able to share my own pain in these circles. And in all my years of peacemaking, I've never been so up close to the pain of the other." Enemies become transformed. But the Psalms of Lament also give voice to the pain, to grieve God's silence, God's hiddenness. Isn't it fascinating in our Bible that God actually gives us the words to say and help us talk about the experience of God's hiddenness? It's amazing. And it can seem unfaithful to name that God is far away. It can seem doubtful to question God. Why are you not acting in line with your character, God? But when we name that, we're naming God's character. This is who you are, God. You're just, you're true, you're peace-loving. But help us see that in the midst of our illness, our exile, our enemies. And as we named the pain of silence, the hiddenness of God, it helped him dismantle the walls of silence that had stood for so long. As he sat with his friends, one man acknowledged to them, "My brother was murdered 40 years ago and you were there with me. But even though you were there, I felt alone for years." That was a shock to hear. One clergy talked about the feeling of isolation from colleagues when he tried to stand up to the violence, and his colleagues shunned him and he lost friends. But by naming that, the Judas Psalm, Psalm 109, becomes a comfort. But what is the sound of reconciliation? Some scholars say, well, because Jesus came to deal with the enemy on the cross, we need to edit these psalms. We don't really need to cry out all the tears in this way. And yet I want to suggest that Jesus doesn't reduce lament, he expands it. Psalm 109 travels far in the Bible, not just into Jesus' life and death and resurrection, but actually into the early church in Acts. Acts 1 talks about Judas and quotes Psalm 109. Another will take his place of leadership. And by quoting this psalm in the new church story, Judas becomes the unnamed enemy of Psalm 109, against whom the psalmist imprecates. And Jesus, rather than being this passive victim servant who suffers unjustly, becomes the imprecator, crying to God for the enemy to be destroyed. And this changes the perspective of Psalm 109. Rather than just being this human-like Davidic curse against the enemies, it changes to the King of Kings holding judgment. The King of Kings who should not have been judged and yet hung on a cross for us, now holds divine authority to judge in the right way. The passive victim and the triumphant judge coalesce so that our wounds have freedom to find our place in that. I wonder if we'd prayed and sung these psalms during the Troubles, would it have saved lives? Would it have prevented the empty chair at the table? In each focus group, our goal was to use lament as a lens to adjudicate Western Christianity's triumphalism into a humble posture, to create movement from being stuck tightly in a crisis, to complaining, to shaking your fists at God, to petition. How do you want to pray today? What do you want to say to God? And sometimes if the group was ready, we asked, what is the sound of reconciliation for you? So that we can pick that sound and put it into the music of the psalm. For one, it was the sound of birds singing. This young woman, as part of her job, after a bomb, had to go and clean up the proxy bomb human remains on the street. And the first time she did it, she saw the birds picking over the pavements. And she carried guilt for years that she didn't shoo them away. And for her now, the sound was of beautiful birds singing, transforming the pain. For another, it was the sound of a baby crying. His brother had been murdered, and for years his prayer was, God, just do the same to them as what they did to my brother. And it did happen. The murderer was blown up by his own bomb, but strangely it didn't bring him peace. But then he found out the name of his brother's murderer. He found out the birth date of his brother's murderer. He found out the place of where the murderer was born and realized this man was born the same week and in the same place as my brother. So that meant they were on the same hospital ward as babies. My mother would have been with the murderer's mother, looking at those tiny babies, cooing over them, holding them, watching them cry. And he said, the sound of reconciliation is the sound of the baby crying, for it has helped me humanize my brother's enemy. So you see, lament is not unfaith. It's the opposite. It's entrusting ourselves to God's mysterious purposes, God's sovereign purposes. The first lament in the Bible is the story of Abel's blood crying out from the ground for justice. And I think it's important to remember that this lament is more than just simply asking God to make it right, because Abel couldn't have been made right. He was dead. He couldn't be brought back to life. But this lament bears witness to the darkness, that something as unthinkable as murder does have larger redemptive purposes. The peace agreement is now over 25 years old in our country. We've had gradual decommissioning of weapons, but there's still traumatic wounds to be tended to. There are now more peace walls in Belfast, peace walls, than before the Belfast Peace Agreement, just to keep law, to keep things orderly, to keep things safe. And so lament is a verb. Lament is an ongoing verb. We will never stop lamenting. But in lamenting, we cry hope. Reinhold Niebuhr said, "Nothing that is good can be done in a lifetime, but we're doing it for the next generation." And it might not make complete sense now, but that is faith, isn't it? And so peace comes dropping all too slowly, but it comes nonetheless. And so I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of the morning to where the broken places sing. May these lament psalms help you in whatever stories you're inhabiting in this time, and may they bring solace, comfort, hope, knowing that Jesus is with you. Amen.
Would you join me in visual prayers, please? There's a lot in that one. Kind of have two things I might want to do, but I might keep it simple. Let's go for it. So I'm feeling this first, thinking about the tension that we're all living in, and seeing those images of military force, I think really struck me. So there's just this idea of something very hard happening, and then I'm feeling like a little bit of a break, but then there's this movement to see differently, right? So something tight, something breaking, and then move to see differently. And then I want to add in the peace dropping slowly. I really love that. All right, let's do that one more time, because that gave you a lot. Something tight, and there's a break, but we need new perspective, and then we're going to allow peace to drop slowly. That feels good. All right, let's find your visual prayer. Turn to your partner. Word or phrase that stood out to you. Go ahead and switch partners if you haven't already. All right, let's come back together. So let's see your visual prayer, and I'll be doing this. Beautiful. Lovely. All right, let's put it together. I'm going to start with something tight. There's a break, and the need for new perspective, and peace is going to fall slowly. Then your visual prayer. Beautiful. Beautiful. Then, Lord, hear our prayers, and we receive your response. One more time without words.